Ms. Lemets, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Sergey Vershinin, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Distinguished President, colleagues, we would like to thank USG on Humanitarian Affairs, Mark Lowcock, and UNICEF Executive Director Henrietta Fore for the briefings they've provided. Overall, we share the concerns expressed by UN representatives and other international organizations too, as regards the humanitarian and social economic situation in Syria. Today, the vast majority of Syrians, more than 90%, are living below the poverty line. 60% of them are going hungry, and 2 million children do not have access to education. It is paradoxical but true. The substantial worsening in the quality of life in Syria has been observed over the last year when, on the ground, violence was reduced significantly. It is telling that the most dire situation is in the regions not controlled by Damascus in the northwest, north and northeast of Syria, the responsibility for which, I will recall, is borne by the de facto occupiers of the country and the local authorities. There is still a serious challenge for Syria posed by ISIS and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham terrorists who control Idlib and have also increased their activities in recent times in the area beyond the Euphrates. In line with the decisions of the international community, the tireless fight against them should continue. At the same time, we'd like to underscore once again that the counter-terrorism activities of the Syrian government, with the support of Russian military, is measured in nature and takes into account the necessary safety for civilians. Attempts to exonerate terrorists and present them as an armed opposition with the assistance, inter alia, of pseudo-humanitarians from the white helmets is unacceptable and merits condemnation. Given the worrying deterioration of the situation in Syria, staff of specialized international organizations on the ground are calling not only for increased urgent humanitarian assistance, which barely covers the most basic needs of Syrians, but they're also working on implementing projects for early reconstruction and support for the people. In response, countries that are the most responsible members in the international community, mainly the US and Europe, we hear assurances that Syrians will not receive anything for reconstruction until the country holds political reforms. The reactions from Washington and Brussels to the UN Secretary General's appeal for a weakening and lifting of unilateral sanctions against the backdrop of the coronavirus pandemic led to the opposite, to an unprecedented tightening of unlawful restrictions adopted in circumvention of the UN Security Council, including in June 2020 the infamous Caesar Act. Unfortunately, today the statement from the distinguished representative of the US and from other Western colleagues spoke a lot, apart from about sanctions of the US and the EU, and about the dramatically negative impact on Syrians themselves. So, on the humanitarian exemptions, given the total deficit in Syria of bread, of fuel, spare parts, medication and medical equipment, which affects not only normal Syrians, but also specialized agencies of the UN and NGOs. We don't even need to mention this. At the same time, we're still receiving information that American convoys carry oil and grain out of Syria into Iraq every day. On the 23rd of March alone, according to information that received, 300 oil trucks crossed the Syrian-Iraq border, and more than 200 lorries with grain have done so since the start of the month. It's clear that while Syrians are suffering from a severe lack of goods, including bread and oil, there's a tide of contraband Syrian natural resources leaving the US-controlled area beyond the Euphrates, and in parallel there is an economic suffocation of the country as a result of unilateral sanctions, which is a form of collective punishment all over. And here now we're at 3.5 months until Security Council Resolution 2533 on the cross-border mechanism for humanitarian assistance expires. Only now are we starting active discussions on how there is no alternative for this kind of scheme. It is interesting to note that we were talking about unlawful trafficking across borders. This question is never raised, but for the delivery of humanitarian assistance, we need a special resolution. It's also interesting to note that the acute humanitarian problems in other countries, in Yemen, in Libya, in Venezuela, command less attention of the Security Council. So far, under Resolution 2355, as part of the cross-border mechanism, there is one crossing point in Bab al-Hawa for the Idlib de-escalation zone. Since July last, when the resolution was adopted, the capacity of this border crossing was increased to record levels. And now, according to data from our UN colleagues, 1,000 lorries cross every month. Despite this, the humanitarian situation in the northwest of Syria continues to worsen. At the same time, in the de-escalation zone, so far it has not been possible to send a joint UN Red Cross Red Crescent convoy across the line. And this convoy was agreed to by Damascus as far back as April 2020, so a year ago. From one briefing to the next, we hear vague explanations as about the need to receive consent from some parties in Idlib to deliver urgent humanitarian assistance. One thing is clear, that we're talking about those parties who let through similar deliveries, but through the cross-border delivery mechanism. If we bear in mind that the Idlib de-escalation zone is controlled by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Hurras ad-Din terrorists, recognized as terrorists by the Security Council, then it becomes a lot clearer who these parties are. Moreover, those same fighters are hindering the free exit of civilians from Idlib through the specially opened humanitarian corridor with the assistance of Russian military. I'll take another example. On the 11th of March, during the distribution of humanitarian assistance in Rami, in the town of Rami, fighters took food from civilians, which led to an armed conflict with around 10 casualties. This confirms once again that help isn't getting into the hands of those who need it, but is being siphoned off by terrorists, who then impose levies on humanitarian deliveries and severely repress the civilian population. In fact, these fighters are using civilians as hostages to receive humanitarian supplies through some obscure mechanism, due control over which the UN cannot provide because of a lack of access to the northwest of Syria. A similar situation happened with those in the Rukban camp in the US-occupied 55-kilometer zone around At-Tanf in South Syria. There, according to Washington's strange logic, assistance should be provided from Damascus, but not across the border with Iraq, which is the most direct and swift route. This is used to supply the American base. Again, we have the European Conference in Brussels on humanitarian assistance to Syrians. The organizations traditionally invite the government of Syria, members of the UN, to discuss how can you possibly discuss this without representatives of the government. And we have UN representatives in Damascus who are doing all they can to support international humanitarian action. Overall, we can see a blatant politicization of the humanitarian issues, discrimination against Damascus-controlled regions from point of view of providing humanitarian assistance, and a refusal to provide assistance to restoration and recovery and return of refugees, a tightening of sanctions against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic, and an urge to preserve this cross-border mechanism, which violates the norms of international humanitarian law and the guiding principles as contained in Resolution 46/182 of the UN General Assembly. They're doing this with one goal in mind, to undermine the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria for political motivations, because they simply do not like the government of the country. In this connection, we regret, and it is also of condemnation, that there were ongoing violations by a whole host of Western countries of the spirit and letter of Resolution 2254, starting from the second paragraph, which refers to the strong commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic, and also the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Thank you for your attention.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Vershinin.